Hey everyone. It is Monday, November the 16th, and Tuesday, November the 17th. And today, what we're going to be talking about is the early parts of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. So, last week we spent time talking about the beginnings of the war with Lexington and Concord that we're finishing up this week, and we're going to move on from there. So, let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so the topic of the presentation is Declaration of Independence, but we're going to actually get started here with the war itself. So last week, we talked about Lexington and Concord, and that was the first two battles, or the first battle of the war. Remember, we talked about who fired the first shot. It's a little bit unclear from history at whether the colonists started it or the British, but regardless, the war broke out. The colonists sent the Olive Branch petition. Nothing much came of that. The British were not willing to settle for a reasonable accommodation, so war broke out. And this, sent shockwaves throughout the colonies, all the way from, up in New England, where Lexington and Concord were there in Massachusetts, all the way down through Virginia and Georgia, the southern colonies. And the colonial leaders, pretty soon after, held the Second Continental Congress. So remember the First Continental Congress we talked about last week. Now we have the Second Continental Congress that meets in Philadelphia in May of 1775 to make decisions about what are they going to do? How are they going to proceed with the fact that a war is breaking out now between the colonists and the British? And so the first thing that was on their agenda was defense. So how are they going to defend themselves? How are they going to defend the colonies against the British? So they do a couple things. First off, they choose George Washington as their supreme commander. So they give George Washington the leadership of what becomes known as the Continental Army. So remember, George Washington, experienced military man. Remember, he had been a British officer in the British Army during the French and Indian War. Well established, well known, and they make him the supreme commander of the Continental Army. And they also decide to pay that army by printing paper money. They have to be able to pay the army. You can't just depend on people to fight for free. So they say, hey, we're going to, decide to come have our own form of money here. So we're going to print paper money to be able to pay our military. And that's an important power of government. Once an organization starts to print their own money and have their own money, that's a pretty big symbolism of what a government does. But even though they did these things, they were split or divided about what they wanted to do, what action they wanted to take next. So some delegates wanted to immediately cut ties with Britain and declare independence, to have the 13 colonies become their own country and completely declare independence from the British. Others, though, still kind of had that same spirit of the Olive Branch petition, saying, hey, we're British subjects, we're, loyal to the king. Let's try to make a deal here. Obviously we're upset at the way we've been treated, but hopefully we can still make a deal with the king and make peace. So these divisions were among the colonists themselves. You had two different groups. You had what becomes known as the Patriots, and these were individuals that favored independence and were willing to fight for it. So these are people that want to make that clean break with the British, saying we're no longer British subjects, we're going to be our own independent country. The other group were the Loyalists, and these are people that remained loyal to Britain and the king. It didn't always mean that they agreed with everything that the king did or that the British did. In fact, some of them were upset, but they said, hey, even though we're upset here with the king and upset with the British, we're still part of Britain. We want to remain loyal to our British king. And really about a third of the colonists would be categorized as loyalists. So it wasn't like it was just a small group of people. It was a pretty big group. So who were some of these people that were loyalists? People from wealthy families, people that served in the government, people that were slave owners, and Native Americans. And all these different groups benefited from the British. people from wealthy families were making a lot of money off of trading back and forth from Britain. Government officials were directly collecting paychecks from the British government, so that's where the loyalty is going to be. Enslaved African Americans, then because Britain had already started to wind down slavery, they're saying, hey, maybe if we stay loyal, they're going to give us our freedom as well. And then some of the Native Americans that had fought on the side of the British during the French and Indian War. But most of the colonists were patriots, however. So about a third were loyalists and about 2/3 were patriots. The first major battle after Lexington Concord is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which takes place in the summer, June of 1775. And it's actually held, it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it's actually held mostly on a hill next to Bunker Hill, which is Breed's Hill. And these are in Boston again. And from there, they could sit on top of that hill and they could fire at the British ships that were down in the harbor. The British troops marched up the hill saying, hey, we're not going to let these rebels, in their words, sit here and just shoot at our ships. We're going to capture this. We're going to capture the hill and drive them away. That's what the British decided to try to do, try to march up the hill and drive the American colonists off of that hill. And it was kind of unclear about how this was going to go. You have a British army that's battle tested. It's a good army by standards of the time. But now you have this American volunteer army that hasn't fought before. So it's experience versus unexperienced. But in this battle itself, the Americans actually do pretty well. They hold off 2 different attacks from the British, and they finally have to give up after the 3rd one just because they run out of ammunition. They start to run out of ammunition, so they have to fall back. So the British, they won this battle. They did eventually drive the American colonists off of the hills, but they lost quite a few troops. In fact, it was about double. So twice as many British soldiers were casualties or killed in this battle as the American colonists. So the Americans are temporarily driven out of Boston. So George Washington, he orders for cannons that had been captured at Fort Ticonderoga. So Fort Ticonderoga is up in upstate New York. So you see here's Boston, over here's the state of New York, down here's New York City. Upstate New York is way up here. So this is really on the border of what's now Vermont in New York. So these cannons had been captured up here, but Washington wants those cannons to be brought back down to Boston, and that's what happens. So Henry Knox is a guy, another general that Washington sends to get those cannons, and they drag these cannons basically in the middle of the winter. It takes about 3 months. They drag them on sleds through the snow back down to Boston. Once those cannons arrive, it gives Washington and his army more firepower, and they're able to finally drive the British out of Boston and retake Boston for the American colonists. So even though the Americans, they did have these early victories, they showed well at Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, and then with the cannons they got from Fort Ticonderoga, they were able to drive them out. The British still had some pretty big advantages. They controlled a huge navy. This was the most powerful navy in the world, the best navy in the world, and it gave them an advantage in troop numbers. They could move troops around back and forth from Europe and supplies, and it also allowed them to blockade American ports, which means they could blockade the port where nothing could come out. So the colonists couldn't get supplies or send anything out. So they were basically trapped in America. They weren't able to get any supplies they needed or trade with anybody else. The British also had enough money they could hire mercenaries to help them fight. These are professional soldiers that they would hire. One important group in the American Revolution are called the Hessians. The Hessians were a group of German soldiers that were hired by the British. And we'll talk about them later on, probably next week or the week after. The Americans also kind of overextend themselves. They try to invade Canada. And try to make quick work of the war. That backfires. They don't do too well. They have to fall back. And now, after the Americans realize that they can't just take over Canada, they realize that this isn't going to be a war that's over very quickly. It's going to be a long struggle if they're going to manage to be successful. So in 1776, most of the colonists weren't patriots or loyalists. They were somewhere in the middle. They were torn about what to do. They were, at one point said, hey, we're loyal to the king, but also the king's treating us like crap. What do we do here? We're kind of stuck in the middle. So that starts to change with a guy named Thomas Paine. So in January 1776, a colonist, a printer named Thomas Paine, he writes a pamphlet. So this would be, a colonial example of a newspaper or a magazine that starts to get a lot of attention. This was Thomas Paine. He writes it, it's called Common Sense. And he makes argument that, no, we need to have independence. We need to be done with the British. It voiced colonists that, had felt that way, but hadn't really expressed that belief. His argument is it's common sense to, for what's happened, it's common sense for us to leave the British to become independent. That's where the name Common Sense comes from. So here's some quotes. The king is a royal brute. Kings shouldn't rule over people. Americans should govern themselves. These are some arguments that Thomas Paine makes in Common Sense. And it sells really, really well. It sells more than 500,000 copies. And public opinion starts to shift. More and more colonists start to favor independence because of the ideas that are expressed by Thomas Paine in Common Sense. And it also increases among those representatives in Continental Congress. So some of those influential people also read this and start to be persuaded by the ideas of Thomas Paine. So the Continental Congress goes ahead and appoints a committee to try to come up with a resolution to this issue. And they appoint 3 people: Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, John Adams from Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, 3 of the more influential members of the Continental Congress. And they come up with and they write what becomes the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was the actual person that wrote the Declaration. Franklin, Adams, he would use those guys to bounce off ideas, particularly Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was pretty influential with this, but Thomas Jefferson is the individual that actually writes the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence is broken up into 4 parts: the Preamble, the Declaration of Natural Rights, the list of grievances, and then the Resolution of Independence. So the Preamble is the reason. So the Preamble says why this document's being written, to explain why the colonists are breaking ties with Britain. So if you want to say it's an introduction, so the Preamble is an introduction saying what this document's going to be about. The Declaration of Natural Rights. Jefferson describes natural rights that all people have. So he actually plagiarized this part. This comes from an English philosopher, John Locke, from 100, 200 years earlier. So John Locke had this idea of natural rights. So Thomas Jefferson uses those ideas that Jefferson has, or that John Locke has, in the Declaration of Natural Rights, such as all men are created equal, people are given unalienable rights. These are rights that can't be taken away, and it's the government's job to protect these rights. And if it fails, the people have an obligation to change their government and create a new one that works better for them. The next part is the list of grievances. And Jefferson claims that the British government violated the colonist rights. So he lists the grievances. It's a pretty long list. There's over 20 of them. So there's, I think, 27, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, grievances of what the British had done wrong and why the colonists are angry. So, for example, denying trial by jury, taxing them without their consent, quartering troops in their homes. There's just this real long list of what the British had done wrong. And since the last one, since King George III, he ignored everything from the colonists. The colonists had asked for, him to fix these issues, and he never did. They say that he's not fit to be the ruler of a free people. And that hereby all ties between the colonies and the British government are dissolved, and they are no longer British subjects. Congress then approves this on July the 4th, 1776. So in Philadelphia on July the 4th, the Continental Congress, the second one, approves the Declaration of Independence. And that's why, we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day today. And it remains an inspiration for Americans and people around the world, not just here in this country. It inspires people all over the world, later on with the French Revolution, for example. But at this time, this wasn't a little thing to do. This was a pretty serious and frightening step, because basically these guys were signing their own death warrants too. If this didn't work out and they ended up not getting independence, they were going to get charged with treason, and they were all going to be executed. So this is a pretty serious thing for the members of the Continental Congress to do. So they're challenging probably one of, if not the most powerful nation in the world, the British, and then again risking the lives of not only themselves but all the colonists. So again, this is pretty dangerous, but at this point they've made their decision and there's no turning back. They've declared their independence. They've said, forget you British, we're done with you. And at this point, there's no turning back here. But, this isn't over. It's not like the British just said, hey, you declared your independence, cool, go do your thing. There's still a war to win at this point. So there's a lot to go on from this point that we'll talk about with next week. All right, guys, have a good day.